Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the SQF post-conference recap. We came up with this idea because there's just so much information at the conference that we wanted to share. So we all brainstormed and thought, how can we do this? And let's have a learning lunch that kind of summarizes what the conference was about and gives you a couple highlights of some of those top-rated sessions. So fortunately for us, we have 3 of those presenters that presented those top-rated sessions, and they're going to share with you an overview of what their sessions were about and give you some really quick tips that you can take back. So whether you were at the conference or, even if you didn't have an opportunity to come, you'll certainly get some takeaways. So what we're going to talk about today is just a general conference overview. And one of the things that I wanted to point out is if you go to our website, sqfi.com, and you go onto the SQF conference website, Sarah Malinich, our senior manager for marketing, put together a really nice overview and put together the link to the conference app. So if you didn't attend and you didn't download the conference app, or even if you didn't and didn't have a chance to download the conference app, the app has everything. I still go to the app. It has the conference speakers. It has their presentations on there. So go to this website, download it. Sarah also put some quick tips on there on what you can do with this information and how to take it back to your facility and start using it right away, how to network, our social media links, all of that is on this website. So check out the website. It's on our conference, it's on the conference website, and it's just a thank you to all of our sponsors and our attendees and gives you all this information. So take a look at that website. Again, great information on there. But we are going to also do is just give you some general statistics and wrap up of the 2015 or 2014 conference. And then we're going to go over the session overview. So we're going to, like I said, we have 3 sessions. Kathy Crawford is going to talk about stop making excuses, understanding the difference between the use and abuse of alternate controls. Laura Nelson is going to talk about from theory to ROI and those reinforcement techniques for operational excellence. And then Chris Middleton is going to talk about allergens and the comprehensive approach to implementing effective monitoring, validation, and verification programs. After that, we're going to go over the learning lunch schedule for next year. We already put together our key topics that we're going to discuss, and then just kind of give you an anticipation about the conference for 2015, the location, dates, and the hotel information. So let's begin. So the conference statistics. Our conference was held in Orlando, Florida, this past October. So the first number I'm going to throw out to you is 561. That's 561 attendees we had from training centers, suppliers, academics, certification bodies. We had primary producers. We had consultants. Everybody was at the conference. 561, that is a record for us. It was truly an amazing event. I think the best part for me is that looking at the caliber of the attendees and the excitement that everybody had. So for me, it was a great event. By far, this is always my favorite conference, not just because I work for SQF, but because you actually get some key takeaways, and that's what you're going to hear later on today. Second number I'm throwing out for you is 33, and 33 is the number of sponsors we had. And this year we had some great exhibitors. We had our key sponsors, and I do want to thank Alchemy, who is on this webinar and was one of our premium sponsors and also sponsoring this webinar of this learning lunch. So big thank you to Alchemy. But we had 33 sponsors, certification bodies. We also had some new exhibitors regarding some helpful tools that you can use in your facility. We had somebody that manufactured labels that wouldn't spray off. We had shoes. We had microbiology and laboratories. So there was a lot of great sponsors. Again, those are all on our conference app. So if you want to look for anybody that you want to try and do, you're looking for alternative solutions, those sponsors are a great resource for you. The next number is number 9, and that is 9 training sessions we had, and those were our pre-conference workshops. And this is a picture of Gary Smith doing his internal auditor training. We also had advanced practitioner training. We had advanced HACCP training. So we had 9 training sessions all before the conference started that were all pretty much full. I know our advanced practitioner course was a 2-day course, and it sold out in April. So we posted it. I think everything was posted in March, and that course sold out in April. So those training sessions are a big hit and really gets the conference going. The next number is number 2, and that's the number of pre-conference workshops we had. Our first conference workshop was on FSMA, so we had Eric Lieberman talk about the Food Safety Modernization Act and how it's going to affect suppliers. And then our second conference workshop was about a get-to-know-you event and how to get the best out of attending conferences, and that was very well received. The next number is 6, and 6 is the number of keynote speakers we had. We had a great bunch of keynote speakers, and I'm going to go over those in just a little bit. The next number is 12, and 12 is the number of breakout sessions we had. And the best part about these breakout sessions is that they were repeated. So we had breakout sessions, we had sessions A, B, and C, and they were repeated throughout the conference. So if you couldn't make the morning session, you could capture it in the afternoon session. So it was a great opportunity to get more than your share of information with those breakout sessions. And our next number is 4, and that is the number of deep dive sessions that we had. And this year we incorporated some and combined some similar topics to offer these deep dive sessions. And Chris Milton is going to talk about part of his deep dive sessions that he did on allergens. So that was really a good addition to us this year. And our next number is 10, and 10 is the number of scholarship winners we had. The FMI Foundation offers scholarships, and we had 10 scholarship winners, and I'll talk about those in just a second. And our last number is 8, and 8 is the number of award winners we had for SQF. And again, I'm going to break those out in just a couple slides. So we had some great statistics at the SQF conference, really great sessions. And again, go to that conference app, and you can get not like you were there, but really you can get a lot of this information right from your app. So our SQF award winners, every year we offer SQF awards for these following categories. And our award winners are rated on the application that they submit and how much they are participate within the SQF program, are committed to food safety, and really go above and beyond just their daily duties. So here are award winners that the selection committee identified as being the top in their particular category. So congratulations to all these award winners. For us, we're so lucky to have so many wonderful partners. The next thing is the FMI Foundation Scholarship winners. So this is the second year that we have offered scholarships. So the FMI Foundation is there to promote food safety, and what we have identified is these award winners that are pursuing or interested in a career in auditing. So what the foundation has done is supported a subcommittee on developing curriculum for the universities to promote auditing as a career. So the foundation has identified 10 award recipients. Each recipient received scholarship money, but they also received complimentary registration and room and board to the 2014 conference. And to all of these recipients, that actually was better than receiving the money, because this gives them an opportunity to network with other food safety professionals, understand what their career options are. It really is such a benefit. So I have put the website on here. If you go on our website, sqfi.com, under the professional, SQF professional, you'll see the auditing career resources, and you'll see the award winners. You'll see exactly what are some of those resources for auditing as a career. So this is a great benefit to these award winners. Some of our top-rated sessions, when you look at the general sessions, are our keynotes. we had some great keynote sessions. We had the Gen Y guy with Jason Dorsey. We had a discussion about ethics from a professor. We looked at why we make mistakes, and which was a really great topic, especially if you're an auditor, because you're looking but you're not truly seeing. We heard from a special agent in the FBI regarding WMD and food defense, and what are some of those things that we need to be concerned about today. So food defense always seems like a topic of the past since 9/11, but really what Special Agent Stephen Nass described is what are we looking at now as it relates to the threats to our industry, the food industry. And then we also heard about behavior and the people side of food safety, and how to look at people's behavior as it relates to working in groups and teams. So one of the things that our top-rated session was the Gen Y guy, and this was Jason Dorsey, who pretty much gave us an overview of the Y generation, or the entitlement generation, or the millennials, whatever you want to call them. But here's some quick facts. I don't know if you knew this, but we really have 4 distinct generations working side by side in the workplace at the same time. The traditionals, which are your pre-1946, those are the war era generation. And they offer a lifetime of experience. They really have lived through a lot, the Depression, the war, all of that, and they have offered great experience. Then we have the boomers, which are from 1946 to 1965. And these boomers have tremendous work ethic and make effective team leaders. Then you have the Gen X, which are kind of skeptical because they saw some things happen. They saw, they saw the Vietnam War. They saw their parents get laid off from long-term jobs. They saw, recessions. So for Gen Xers, there's a little skepticism for them, and really for those guys, you really they want commitments to be kept. Then there's the Gen Yers, which is what he basically talked about. He's a Gen Yer. So they are known as the entitlement generation, but really what he clarified for everybody is that they're not entitled, they just have big expectations. And what they have is all the energy and big expectations, and what they need is somebody to kind of direct them as to where they need to go. They need leadership, they need direction. So all in all, because of this is the first time in history that this has happened, you can have a pretty dynamic group and use this to your advantage and create these multi-generational teams and have a tremendous value because you get a great variety of experience and can really accomplish a task using all different sides and all different ways of looking at things. A couple other quick facts is that the Gen Yers is really the fastest growing demographic in the workplace. They're out there to outpace those baby boomers. And then the other thing that he mentioned, which I found very interesting, is that the Gen Y, we keep thinking they're tech savvy, but they're not. They don't. What he said is the Gen Xers really developed all the technology, the iPhones and iPads and all of that, but they're tech dependent. So when we write them a note, it'd be better to text or better to email. They're very tech dependent, and that's really what they focus on. So those are some quick tips that I pulled out of his conversation. One thing you might want to do is Google Jason Dorsey. He has some great videos on how to take the Gen Y generation and incorporate them into your workplace and create those effective teams and use the strengths from all these different generations to your advantage when you're building these teams. It was a great session. It was actually the most highly rated session in our conference. So we did have, like I said, those breakout and deep dive sessions. These were the top sessions that we had: demystifying unannounced audits, the difference between abuse and alternate controls, those reinforcement techniques for operational excellence, sanitation, creating a winning internal audit team, and a session about allergens. So fortunately for us, we have three of the speakers from these top sessions that are going to provide you with an overview of their session. So we're so fortunate today to have these speakers talk to us. So our first speaker is going to be Kathy Crawford, from the Eagle Certification Group. And her session, as I mentioned, is on Don't Make Excuses, Understanding the Difference Between the Use and Abuse of Alternate Controls. After that, Laura Dunn Nelson, who is the Vice President of the Technical Services and Business Development with Alchemy Systems, is going to provide an overview of her session from theory to ROI, those reinforcement techniques for operational excellence. And then lastly, Chris Middleton with the Stereotech Group is going to provide an overview of his session on allergens, the comprehensive approach to implementing effective monitoring, validation, and verification programs. So as Leslie mentioned, we're going to move forward with today's, the heart of the learning lunch. If you have questions regarding this, regarding the sessions, if you have questions for any of the speakers, chat them, just chat them in the box. Leslie and I will monitor them, and then at the end of all three sessions, we'll get to your questions and ask them from each of the speakers. So with that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kathy Crawford, and she is going to talk about the abuse and use of alternate controls.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you for the introduction, and welcome to everyone. Good afternoon to those on the East Coast, and good morning to those in other locations. Just a brief clarification. I do a lot of training and consulting that is sponsored by Eagle Certifications, but I'm actually a member of the HACCP Consulting Group, which is based in Fairfax, Virginia. I'm more than pleased to be here to talk about this and to be involved with SQF because I truly believe SQF works. I've seen companies grow and become better companies producing better food because of SQF. And one of the things that makes it work is that it's a very practical code. And the thing to me that makes it practical is what I call the alternate control clause. And if you've been in one of my training courses, I always kind of tease people and say, what is your favorite section in the code? And they never seem to have a favorite because the code is no fun. But after talking about it, they come to realize that perhaps 2422 is or should be their favorite section because it is what makes it make sense to me. So if you look at the words on this slide, there's quite a few. There's actually about 50 words and 10 or 12 symbols tossed in there. If you take a moment to read it, I can just bet first time through, or even second or third time through, it's not clear what it says because it's not simple. Take a moment and look at that. Now, if you want to narrow it down to a shorter phrase, we can take those 50 words that talk about what suppliers have to do and say it very simply as this. It essentially says, comply with the code or explain why you don't. But that's oversimplifying it, so let's take a closer look at that. What it says is that the supplier shall ensure, that means you have to do something. What you have to do is make sure the food safety fundamentals, those things described in the sections of the code that apply to you, have to be applied or exempted according to a risk analysis, and that's outlined, and what that risk analysis does is outline your justification for an exclusion or evidence that you have an alternate control measure in place. So that's still a lot of words, but the bottom line is that you must ensure food safety is not compromised if you choose or if for some reason you do not precisely follow the requirements of the code. So let's look at it a bit more closely because I don't want someone to misuse this by assuming that simply you don't have to follow the code. You do. But you have three options. You can do precisely what the code says, or you can justify an exclusion through a risk analysis, or you can provide evidence that you have an effective alternate control in place, and you provide this evidence through a written risk analysis. So there's a few key words, and I can't go through all of them because this is an abbreviated session today, but one key word is an alternate control. That's not defined by the code. My definition of an alternate control is an action or condition that's used to address a potential risk differently from what is defined or prescribed by the code itself. So if you do something slightly different, that may be an alternate control. And when you collect evidence that this control is effective, that's usually the primary component that's necessary for you to justify an exclusion from a section in the code. Another key word is the word justify. You have to justify an alternate control, and that means provide a good reason for what you're doing, to provide a good reason for your actions or for conditions. A justification should never be an excuse. An excuse is when you have to give a explanation for something and it's uncomfortable. You're feeling guilty. You're feeling unprepared. A justification is stronger. A justification can be put in place when you've collected data and you've approached something logically and systematically so that there is no impression of guilt, and you're prepared for an audit by having justified alternate controls where they're necessary. So we do this through a risk assessment, and that's another word that's also not clearly defined. One definition I've seen is it's the identification, evaluation, and estimation of the amount of risk to determine or justify appropriate controls or to prioritize controls. It's also been defined as a scientific process that includes 4 basic components. It's identifying hazards, characterizing those hazards, looking at how others might be exposed to those hazards, for example, your customers, and then combining those factors into a risk characterization. So it can be somewhat complicated in the definition, but the important thing is that you have to perform some type of risk assessment or risk analysis in order to justify an alternate control. So I like to simplify things. I try to keep things very practical. There are a lot of complex systems out there on how to do a risk analysis or risk assessment. I break it down into 4 steps. The first being identify what is the risk or what is the question or the intent of the code that you're concerned about. The second step is to collect data. The third step is to summarize what you learned from that data and respond to what you learned. And the fourth step is to maintain control of your system. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at each of those parts. In identifying the question, make sure you evaluate the relationship of a specific control to a specific hazard. That's very important. Oftentimes we go out to measure something and we are running out to collect data without making sure we have asked the question clearly in our mind. So make sure you do that first. And then identify any scope or limitations to what you are considering. For example, does the risk you're evaluating only impact one production line or one product or one particular area or one shift within your whole system? It's important to be very specific and to be objective when you set out to do a risk assessment. For example, don't set out to prove that something is safe. Go out to evaluate whether or not something is safe. And to keep it in perspective, make sure you understand that you should associate your risk assessment to your mission and to the risks that are perceived by the end user. Often our end users don't have the same understanding of risk that we do. Every stakeholder places a different value on things, and that's particularly true when we talk about quality and our quality HACCP-based plans, those quality control plans. Each stakeholder might have a different perspective on risk, so it's important to have multiple people have input into your risk analysis. And then consider how much effort you're going to put into this risk analysis. There are very complicated risk analysis and risk assessments that have been conducted that have taken years, 10 years, or there are other ones that can be done very quickly. Somewhere in between 10 minutes and 10 years is the right answer for you, but the decision on how long and how much effort and resources you put into a risk analysis must be based on risk. So you're going to define what are you concerned about. Then you need to go out and collect data and analyze that data. The scope that you defined at the beginning is going to drive how much data you need to collect. That's why it's so important to clarify the question at the beginning. You should estimate how a particular risk might impact your customers, and then try to quantitatively, using numbers, or qualitatively, using words, assign a risk level to what you're looking at. And we've seen charts from SQF that helps us with a risk matrix, help us identify what may or may not be a significant risk. Or we've seen other systems where people identify risk levels by looking at severity and likelihood of certain events and using words like high, medium, and low to define risk. This is what you need to do to collect data. And then you summarize your results. So sometimes that summary might be a number, or it might be a few words, such as medium likelihood and low severity. Those are good. Those tools are important, but I also highly recommend that you summarize with full sentences as a best practice, because your goal is to communicate to others your thought process and to show that it was logical and that you addressed the key types of hazards. And those include the traditional biological, chemical, and physical. But don't forget, there's also concerns when it comes to regulatory concerns or customer concerns, particularly with quality plans for Level 3 SQF certification. So collect your data and summarize the level of risk that exists in an objective manner, and make sure that it is clearly written so that you can share it with others. Then you want to respond to that risk, and risk management is the response. It includes any adjustments you might make or implementation of controls you might make that define how well an alternate control has been implemented. When you define risk, you can choose to accept risk and control it. You can prevent, eliminate, or reduce risk by changing your management system, or you can transfer risk by perhaps having a subcontractor or a contract manufacturer conduct certain functions for you. Once these decisions have been made and an alternate control is in place with a defined risk assessment supporting it, that should be reassessed at least annually to make sure you're maintaining a certain level of control. So here's an example to make this practical in case you can't think of where this would come into play for your own system. The code states in Module 11 that hand wash basins shall be provided adjacent to all personnel access points. And I probably should have put the word all in bold as well. Every access point should have a sink right there. Well, what if you don't have one? Well, according to the code, that's not okay. And unless you can document with a risk analysis that you have an alternate control, you can get a minor for not having a sink adjacent to all personnel access points. So you might characterize the hazard and say, well, the hazard is biological or chemical because there could be pathogens or allergens on our hands as we enter food handling areas. The potential exposure is that a customer could be impacted if you didn't wash your hands or you touched product contact surfaces and something could be contaminated with bacteria or allergens. Then you might further go on to characterize that risk and say through logical meeting with your food safety team that perhaps a small dose could cause an illness or an allergic reaction. And your team considered that and decided this was a medium risk of happening, but the severity would be high if SQF code conditions were not followed because people can have serious reactions to allergens. So following the code was deemed a risk of low likelihood because if there was a sink adjacent to every access point, there's a low likelihood that there would be a problem. But still there's a high severity potential for this hazard. So look at the risk, compare it to if you followed the code precisely compared to if you had an alternate control. And in this case, the alternate control is that employees are trained, they follow designated pathways to a sink that isn't adjacent to, but it's very near the entrance. So you can see they're not precisely following what the code states, but they have an alternate control, meaning the training and the designated pathway. Then you need to collect evidence of the effectiveness of that control. So you might document that observations were made over a period of, for example, 90 days, and that there were no incidences of people who failed to wash their hands after entry. So you collect data to prove that your alternate control is effective, and the level of risk would be the same if you had implemented the code as the code is written. So for any alternate control, if you do something slightly different from the code, if you can show that the level of risk is controlled to an acceptable level, then you should be able to be fine with your food safety system and with your SQF audit. How you document your risk assessment is up to you. There's any number of formats that can be used. But what's important is that you identify the question, indicate what the code says, and then indicate what you are doing that might be different from the code. and make sure you address all the applicable types of hazards. As I mentioned earlier, you have to address the traditional ones, but don't forget customer and regulatory hazards. And don't forget, in the future, we will need to be addressing radiological hazards. And also consider internal concerns as to whether or not a change might impact your goals or your food safety objectives towards continuous improvement. Make sure you use data, not just your opinion, and you define your conclusions. So those are good ways to use 2422. Abuse of 2422 comes in when you don't collect evidence. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. You have to say that a few times to understand what it means. But here's an example. The code requires documentation and implementation of methods to detect foreign objects. So a company could say, we're exempt. There's no risk. We've never had a foreign object complaint from our customers. And by the way, our 1-800 number is broken and we don't have a customer complaint form. You can't say that there's a lack of risk if you are not looking for that risk or measuring something. So ultimately, you can't say a risk doesn't exist because we haven't seen it. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Another potential abuse of 2422 is by having a program and just saying, well, we have a program, we're fine. So for example, the code requires a risk assessment for alternative storage. And the company might say, we have an outside shed that's a little bit non-traditional storage, so it could be considered alternative storage, and we keep some packaging material there. We have a written program that defines pest control and how risks are managed, and we have an SOP on shed rules. And if I were auditing, I would say, well, great, I'm glad you have a program, and I'm glad you have an SOP, but what is required is evidence of the effectiveness of those controls. So make sure you don't just put programs in place, but you measure them to demonstrate that risk is being controlled. So there are 6 fundamental takeaway messages from this brief presentation on alternate controls. Number 1, a risk assessment is never an excuse to violate regulatory or customer requirements. If something is mandatory, it is still mandatory. Number 2, a risk assessment is not to be used to justify inefficiency or lack of commitment. It's not a tool. 2422 is not a tool to document excuses. It's a tool to document logically thought out approaches to food safety management where you might have a creative but alternate idea and you can prove that idea is effective. Third takeaway, a risk assessment is not a replacement for continuous improvement. If something is not being done one year and it's still not being done the next year and still not being done the following year simply because the company perhaps lacks management commitment or resources to do it, that's not what 2422 is for. You still need to work toward continuous improvement. Another takeaway message is that perceived risk is not equal to actual risk, and that's particularly true with quality defects. When you conduct a risk assessment, make sure you use a multifaceted team and you get input from members within that team so that you truly look at risk, not just from your perspective, but from your customer's perspective. Another important thing is that we often lack agreement on risk, on defining risk. But we're all tasked with managing it and proving whether or not there's effective control. So don't get overly tangled up in the vocabulary. Just make sure you do the right thing. That's what 2422 is about. Don't argue over terminology. Take time rather to collect data and to prove that you are managing potential risks that you've identified or that are identified through the SQF code. The bottom line with all of this is that we have to ensure that our product meets safety expectations and the expectations of the SQF code and our customers and our regulatory agencies. We do this to earn and maintain trust, and that's the bottom line with what we do with developing our SQF systems. So the alternate control clause is put in place to make the SQF code more practical. It enables you to do things a little bit differently, provided you can prove through justification that's documented that what you're doing is effective. I know this was brief, so I put my email address up there in case you would like to contact me to ask more questions and discuss this. And then in the meantime, I would like to pass this on to Laura Dunn Nelson, who is our next speaker.
Thanks, Kathy. Appreciate that. Gosh, what clarity you brought to 2.4.2.2. So excellent information. You know, I'm going to be talking about the use of the workforce, your employees, to really help you drive operational excellence. And, you know, we all have employees, and many of them are doing the right thing, and some of them are not consistently doing the right thing. So we're going to talk about a couple of techniques that are proven, and I'm delighted to be able to share this with you because at the conference we had a fabulous interactive session. It was actually fun. We had lots of feedback and audience participation, so it's going to be a little different for all of you, but hopefully you will be able to pick up a couple of nuggets. You know, one of the things we all rely on is that engagement of employees to help us collectively achieve or maintain SQF certification. The reality that we're dealing with is that a large percentage of our employees are simply not engaged, or worse, they're actively disengaged. And there was a 2013 Gallup survey that was performed, and it really was staggering. The high percentage, 70% of workers that are simply just not engaged. And, you know, the reality is that does a lot of things negatively. It certainly costs a lot in productivity, but it really creates a huge hurdle for us to drive a food safety and quality culture. We engaged in a study with some research experts, and we looked at this challenge of employee engagement. And what we found is that you really have to go beyond training, the typical training that you may be initiating or using in your plants, and really start looking at what other ways can you have effective employee engagement. What we found is we did a study with 4 different food companies, and all of these companies identified an issue in their plants that they wanted to do a deep dive focus on, behaviors. And they've been training their employees on those behaviors for years. We did a pre-training assessment and found out that on average they were about 68% compliant despite that training. We created some really specific training around those behaviors that we were wanting to see in each of those plants, and we were able to increase compliance to those behaviors up to 82%, but obviously it was a shortfall. And what we found out is that if you layer this next that orange bar, that next element into training, which would be the coaching of those employees around those behaviors, one-on-one activities to really either validate that they're doing the right thing and give them an attaboy, or identify what behaviors are not compliant and help work through those. And what was found on average, it was a very significant increase in compliance, up to 94% on average. So very, very insightful. And one of the things we looked at as far as the gap in pre-training and post-training is, there are some handicaps. We talked about multi-generations, and Leanne mentioned our speaker, Jason Dorsey, talking about those different cultures that are now in our workforce. It really creates definitely some advantages, but it also provides us some challenges because those people learn differently. And we also know there's a lot of diverse cultures out there, which brings different languages. We we have customers that have something upwards of 20, 25 different languages or dialects spoke within their facility, and so certainly that's a challenge to adequately and successfully train those individuals on sometimes very complex programs and procedures and sharing behaviors that you're wanting to see. Educational levels, turnover. We only have so much time for training, and given our economic environment that we're in, turnover certainly plays a big role because there are plants out there, and hopefully none of you experience this, but certainly there are plants out there that are in a constant recruiting and hiring mode, and that certainly presents a lot of challenges. Then what we know in our work over the last decade is that there's a lot of ineffective training out there. Many of you as professionals, practitioners, you probably have on your shoulders to put together training, food safety training or quality training for your employees. The reality is that oftentimes that's presented at too high a level. We're trying to squeeze too much into a training event, and so there's a lot of words on there and not enough photos for those visual learners. And then you have your kinesthetic learners that are actually wanting to do things, and they learn through that manner, and sometimes our training doesn't include that. So there's a lot of adult learning aspects that go into training that, as quality control, quality assurance folks, we simply, it's not our language. We don't know that information, and we don't have that skill set. We also know lack of accountability is a challenge, and certainly, it's difficult. Somebody does something wrong and nobody intervenes or provides feedback, then basically that behavior is reinforced. That employee says, well, it's no big deal if I don't wash my hands once or twice. Going back to Kathy's example. So that lack of accountability is a real key. And then management. We always talk about management support. And really, what you want is certainly the support, but you want an active message out there of the importance of that. And certainly your management team does need to walk the walk and talk the talk, and model the behaviors that you're wanting to see out there, and certainly reinforcing the importance of those behaviors. We all do employee observations every day, and I've just listed a couple of these, but the thing that we typically do is we have a checklist. We have a box there, and if we see that we don't see any GMP issues, we're going to check it saying, yep, we're good to go. Or if we don't see any food debris on those conveyor belts, yep, it's ready to run. So it's really just a checklist. And what we've found is there is a difference between checking those activities and really breaking those activities down into behaviors. And I actually presented this material with a co-presenter, and Melody Magallanes from Keurig was my co-presenter on this. And so she had a lot of tangible things. She's actually done a lot of this work with Keurig Green Mountain. She's their safety, quality, environmental learning leader for Keurig. And she shared that their approach was really looking at behavior. So they've tried several things, and they realized that what they need to do is a deep dive on behavior. So why did they select that? Well, they're observable. You can see behaviors. They're certainly measurable. So if you're looking for a sequence of behaviors to execute a certain requirement, those can be documented. They're very specific. In other words, you can really look for, I need this step and this step and this step and this step, and be very specific on any given step that's missing. What she found is those behaviors really precede injury or loss of product or issues with product. So if you can get the right behaviors, you really do a lot of prevention that would have negative cost for your plant. Some of the softer things that it really helps is it really helps to build relationships. So if you're looking for specific behaviors, you're having an opportunity to engage with those employees, and at the same time, you're not looking just to dean them, but you're looking to have an opportunity to give those folks very positive reinforcement, given those folks that are doing the right thing. And really reinforcing that is a very key to building a very strong culture. And it certainly empowers employees because now they become very keen on the specific behaviors that are being requested of them. Leanne mentioned that Jason Dorsey, our keynote speaker, and talking about these generation types. And I just have a quick slide here, and we're not able today to go into a deep dive on this, but when you're looking to coach different employees that are different generations, one size doesn't fit all. And I think sometimes we're in a hurry. We're telling our supervisors, look, I need you to go in there and check this, and here's how I want you to go in and make these observations. And if they're not doing it right, show them what the right thing is to do. Well, that is a direction, but it's not going to be necessarily your most successful approach to coaching these individuals. So I would just suggest that there is some sort of knowledge and education that needs to be done to be more effective in your coaching strategies. As I said, our session was very interactive, and we were able to play several different scenarios. And you'll see in this picture, we had the gentleman holding a tablet. He was a supervisor, and the employee was on the right. And we actually had simulated issues, and the employees really got into this. This was at Keurig, and they knew they kind of hammed it up on what not to do. And then we had what was improved interaction by that supervisor and that employee. But what we did talk about as we looked through each one of these little videos of the scenarios, there were certainly things that the supervisor did appropriately, and then there were definitely opportunities for better interactions. And you can see here that the employee does not have a beard net, and he was going to walk through there without it. So the supervisor is trying to point out, and he's using a readily available industry source tablet app that he's using that's pre-scripted on walking this employee through, saying, look, I was looking for you to stop, wash your hands, apply your hair net, apply your beard net if necessary, and of course it has to be applied, correctly, and then walk through. And so he has all of that script there, and he's able to give that feedback very consistently back to that employee. So if we look at some of the things that we bubbled up from that session, we identified several characteristics of effective observations. One of those is certainly to be timely. It's not going to work if you meet somebody at lunch, an employee, and say, look, I saw you doing something last week that wasn't right. You need to pick up your game, or you need to fix it. I mean, that not connecting the actual behaviors very closely to that feedback is a mistake. So everybody really talked about it needs to be very timely. And it really needs to be focused on business outcomes. Really, the idea is to break down these protocols and procedures into behaviors that are key to your business and really focus. And there's critical behaviors that each of you have in your plant to produce safe, wholesome products. And so those are really the focus of these things. And then on feedback itself, providing feedback, definitely be very specific. Saying something like, well, that doesn't work, or you did it wrong, you have to be very specific on, hey, you missed this point in washing your hands up to your elbow with soap and being very, very specific, because that's how these employees are going to learn and understand the actual sequence of behaviors that you're looking for. And then giving the why. We all talked about in the session how important it is, but how often we don't share the why. What's the impact of not washing with soap? What's the impact of not washing up to your elbow? What's the importance of washing your hands at all? A lot of people are simply not motivated by the answer, well, we have to, right? It's a requirement for SQF certification. That's not going to motivate people to consistently do that particular behavior. So that why is extremely important. And really looking for very specific changes and honing in on those and really getting the opportunity to say, well, you did the first 3 steps right. Congratulations. Those are very important. And you're missing this last step, and here's how I need you to do it. The other thing we talked about, and certainly Melody provided feedback from Keurig, is don't assume you're right as a supervisor. This is an opportunity to say, here's what we're looking for. But what our studies suggested, and Keurig definitely received this feedback, is oftentimes what behaviors you're looking for, may not be able to be done. Maybe somebody can't lift a 50-pound box, or they can't push it up beyond 30 inches, or they can't it's something is in the way and they can't consistently do something. There's an issue with the equipment. This is a great opportunity and a great approach to really tease out those things that are preventing those critical behaviors from happening. And then you can look at, okay, what together, let's fix, because this is what needs to happen to protect our food, and what can we do together to eliminate these challenges so we can protect it. And that's the same thing as asking questions. It's not a one-sided thing. It's, do you have any questions for me as a supervisor? So appreciate you your time. Do you have any questions for me? And it is a give and take. And follow through. Really, Melanie discussed a lot of follow through. So it's not sufficient to go out and pick a couple of employees and make them an example. You really need to provide feedback consistently over the course of time to all your employees, so that they all get that kind of feedback, either positive feedback that they're doing the right thing, or the key feedback on the areas or the behaviors that they're not. And, really we talk about poor feedback, and we had a lot of good conversation about this in our session. And there's a tendency, certainly, to be very personal. We had several of our videos that were a little hammed up, as I said, but some of the supervisor comments was, look, were you sleeping during the training? We went over this. What's your problem? And sometimes that can come out. But really, feedback really cannot be personal. It shouldn't be emotional. It shouldn't be judgmental. You're looking for those behaviors, and you're looking for a correction together, an agreement of correction. It can't be vague. So feedback cannot be vague, or you're not going to get the results that you want. And if you give an opportunity for somebody to say, if a supervisor says, do you have any feedback for me? And somebody starts to talk, and somebody goes, hey, well, never mind, I got to go. That's not good listening skills. And really, if you're going to solicit feedback, those employees, they're there every day. They're doing the work. And so they know what works, what doesn't, what the challenges are. And it's really insightful to really to listen to those folks and to act on some of their feedback. We talked about delay, not timely, lack of structure. When we talk about observations and doing those kinds of coaching observations, really you need structure. You don't want somebody that is a empirical person that's going to bark out orders and as opposed to, oh, it's okay, you don't have to do that, but next time will you do this? You want more consistency. So that's where structure will provide giving feedback, and a lot of people use forms and that says, okay, we're looking for these behaviors. If you're missing this, do this. If you're missing that, here's how you do a root cause analysis, and really can walk through all of that. And then lack of training, and Mel from Keurig really stressed the key element of training. Supervisors are often promoted, as all of us know, mainly because maybe they're the last person that understands this equipment, or they got the most seniority, or a lot of different reasons for promoting people into supervisorial positions. Most of the time, we find that we are not training those folks to motivate employees. We're not training them on good communication skills. We're not training them to be good coaches. And that training is critical in advancing your organization from firefighting, continue to have issues, continue to have GMP issues, et cetera, to a more compliant operation. And she really stressed that the time that she spent in making sure that those people were trained provided a huge payback for them. Just to touch on a couple of maybe not intuitive data, this was from another Gallup survey, but it found that employees, even receiving negative feedback, over 20 times more likely to be engaged than those receiving no feedback or little feedback. So that really is contrary to our instinct sometimes, where we say, wow, we don't want to give people negative feedback. We don't want to be confrontational. It's going to be, I just don't want to deal with the drama. Well, what you have is data that says, wow, these people will be more engaged. These people will accept that. If you go to that next stat, if you focus on an employee's strengths and giving those that recognition and positive feedback, 30 times more likely to manage actively engaged workers compared with managers denying any feedback. So, man, take an opportunity out there, and when you see somebody doing it right, give them great feedback. Tell them you appreciate their support of, the food safety program or your quality program, whatever program you're trying to do, and the impact that has. And then you have that last stat, managers giving little or no feedback fail to engage 98% of them. Employees really, really need that coaching and that feedback. For Mel at Keurig, she had she shared the implementation strategy that she used. And really what they did is they did an analysis of top 5 critical behaviors. Where are those areas that they absolutely have to have and probably need some additional attention? So they definitely involved leadership, and they formed a committee at each site to really do a deep dive with these critical behaviors. And one of the things that she said as part of her strategy was she didn't want it to be a compliant yes, no, you got it. She really used the words committed. So if you achieved all the behaviors in the review and the coaching session or observation session, then you were committed. And that kind of wording, she said, changed the approach that both the supervisors had in executing the observations and coaching events, but also the employees. So it's much more well received. And in fact, her feedback during the session was employees were looking for, hey, when am I going to get some more, coaching or some more observations? They were looking forward to that because they really wanted to find a way to demonstrate that, yes, they're doing the right thing. And they really created some employee champions to help adopt change. And what they found is that it didn't take that supervisor with that tablet app doing those observations, but actually employees were actually doing their own observations with each other and informal observations, saying, look, they're not doing that right. I was just observed, and, yeah, I missed that step too, but here's how you need to do it. And so, again, huge impact on your culture. And then she really stressed following up and reviewing the data that you get, doing a follow-up, and improving on the processes, and both with the supervisors and in employees, and soliciting that feedback for continuous improvement. So finally, what was her return on investment? And really, many times it comes down to this. Well, she was able to, through this process, achieve SQF certification and maintain it, and get 100% on their training portion of the SQF. They applied this process to workplace safety in several instances, and they were able to get a dramatic reduction in injuries. It increased their productivity significantly, so they had a lot of committed employees out there, and again, more engaged employees, and so they had a higher productivity rate. And what they saw is more standardization and globalization across their network. They have multiple sites. Some of them, merged recently, and so they were able to get some standardization just using this process of observations and coaching. So that completes my presentation. I appreciate your time, and I'm going to turn this over to Chris for his presentation on auditing allergen control programs. Chris?
Thank you very much, Laura. It was a great presentation on the return on investment and the communication habits that we should have in there. Very much enjoyed it. Focus of my talk right now is going to be on the actual auditing side of allergen control programs. I was part of the deep dive session that handled allergens along with Douglas Marshall and Jeff Chilton, and they spoke mainly on the sides of best practices within the industry and product testing. I'm going to focus more on what can auditors do, be it SQF auditors or even internal auditors, to audit your allergen control program. I'm currently the program manager for the Audit Ready program that's in place with the Steritech Group. It's a pest prevention company, and our focus in the Audit Ready side is more on the processing, on the food processor side. I come from over 10 years of auditing experience and over 5 years of experience within the SQF program itself, so I'm very familiar with that. In my previous life, I was the technical manager for SQF and some other programs as well at SAI Global. So let me make sure that I'm working here. There we go. So one thing that I want to focus on within this is it's very important for everybody to do things right the first time. I know we learn from mistakes at points, but it's especially important with the mistakes that could occur within our programs, the repercussions that could occur. It's important that we build a proper program from the base all the way to the top in the best possible fashion. And that ensures that it's focusing on quality of not just our products, but the way in which we implement those systems. So it's a habit that we want to focus on. It's not just a one-time deal. It's something that we want to focus on all the time. And this goes back to way back in the day, back to Aristotle's days, as you can see. So it's important that we ensure that the quality of what we do as auditors is focused on that side, and we're doing a great job each time. Now, within the SQF code, there's detailed requirements for an allergen control program. I'm not going to go through every single one of those because it would take some time, but it's all detailed in section 2.8.2 of the SQF code. And you can see it ranges all the way from having a risk analysis for the allergens that are present, handling instructions readily available, verification and validation of cleaning, and any type of a list of allergens that's available to the staff. It's all detailed within the code, so I'll let you kind of read that at your leisure. One key thing to point out, too, is how they have split out some of the requirements. It's not just looking at just having something written down. Is it detailed for traceability? Is it detailed for rework? And we're going to go into that in a bit as well. So, what is the most scored SQF clause? I'm sure many of you have a very good guess. If any of you were in the session, you already know this, but the most scored clause at the present moment typically revolves around the validation of our cleaning programs. Now, this is obviously an extremely important requirement. It's something that should be verified by an auditor every single time that he's going through to ensure if there is a changeover that the sanitation program is effective. But what does this show us? Now, a term that I have stolen from somebody that's on our phone is we call it soft auditing. It's kind of grabbing the low-hanging fruit in a way in our audits. Are we really diving deep into that allergen control program to determine is it effective all the way through, or are we finding the easiest thing to look at and then moving on? Are we just focusing and thinking that allergen control is simply cleaning our equipment, or are we looking at it that it is a more holistic management system type situation that we got to look at in there? So what needs to be present in an allergen control program? Let's kind of review that very quickly and kind of go over as an auditor what you need to be thinking of when you're going in there and looking at. So remember, your allergen control program just doesn't start when allergens arrive at the facility. It starts at the research and development side of things. It's ensuring that we know when we need to add allergens. Can we avoid the addition of allergens if needed? Do we have the appropriate equipment to be used within the facility? Has the facility taken that into account when they're doing it? Have they taken into account during research and development the sanitation needs that may be present? Do they have the equipment present and the chemicals and the wherewithal to complete the sanitation needs if it is required? And what are they going to do about allergen labeling? Are they paying attention to things like country of destination, which is extremely important, country of production, et cetera? Engineering and system design kind of works hand in hand in a way with research and development. Has the facility, and are they able to show you as an auditor, the equipment design has been taken into account when they're designing this, when they're designing their program, designing the product? Have they looked at addition and containment point isolation within their equipment if it's applicable for that type of process? Do they have a dedicated rework system? And we're going to get to rework a bit later again as well. Have they looked at that when they have designed the system? And do they have dedicated production systems? Is that possible within the facility? Has it been taken into account? Has it been something that they have decided against because of cost, or do they have reasoning behind it, et cetera? Need to look at that stuff. Now, a key area that we want to focus on, and this is something that Doug touched on as well, was raw and packaging materials. This is in an important area of, do we have specifications? We know that that is a requirement within the SQF code in a separate section, that there needs to be a register present, that they need to have up-to-date specifications on file. Are they verifying the specifications on a regular basis? Do they have a process for doing that? Does it include allergens within those multi-component raw materials that are being used? What type of allergen control programs are present at the suppliers in which they're getting these raw materials and packaging materials from? Have they reviewed that system from in there? Do they have records to show that they have done something along those lines? And then, has the facility looked at potential cross-contact points between unlike allergens within their own facility, within storage, within transportation within the facility? Has that been assessed and addressed within the program? And then now we'll move on to production scheduling. We talked about it briefly when we looked at system design, where you look at dedicated production systems if it's possible. But are they looking at limiting those changeovers? What does limiting changeovers mean? It means less sanitation, means more efficiency, means less chance of cross-contact between unlike allergens. Do they have a sequencing chart or a matrix that they can follow for the proper sequencing of products? Have they actually allocated clean-out time? Now, this is something that you find as an auditor many facilities have not even taken into account. They schedule, we're going to do runs for 1 hour, and we're going to do 8 runs, and our day is 8 hours long. But they've got to do 3 cleaning sessions in between and haven't allocated any of that time. If they have not allocated that time, we end up risking cross-contact between allergens, and we don't want to have that. Finally, in the production scheduling, have they confirmed the appropriate correct packaging? How do they have that changeover process within there? How do they ensure we don't have potential mixed cartons or inappropriate packaging being used within our system? Speaking of packaging and labeling, are they updating their labels regularly? Do they update them when they are needed if there's changes in formulation, if there's changes in raw materials, if there's changes even in regulatory requirements, like there was recently in Canada, where they changed and they added mustard into their known allergens, and what I mean recently, in the past few years, and that caused labels to be changed and updated. Is there a process for this label review? Do they have the appropriate layout of the labels present? Do they ensure that they use plain language when they're explaining these allergens? Is there a management of excess and expired or obsolete packaging? Has that been addressed as well within their system? Also, how do they prevent mixed cartons from occurring? This can cause potential recalls to occur. So has that been addressed, and is the facility able to show you that they have addressed this problem? Rework. Again, this is a major component of an allergen program, because there's many times where we can use rework from one product and use it into a different product. Unfortunately, if there's an allergen in one and not in the other, we're going to have an issue there. Therefore, do they have an appropriate system, and have they looked at the proper labeling of rework? Have they looked at how those refeed systems, if it's going to be multiple types of rework being used within the production system, have they looked at the sanitation program for that? How have they communicated, or how do they communicate this allergen rework program? Is it efficiently communicated, and is it accurate as is detailed in their program? Do they have dedicated refeed and regrind systems for specific allergens? Is it a dedicated program, or is it a dedicated system, I should say? Sanitation. Now, we already talked about sanitation a bit when it came to the verification of sanitation time when they're looking at the scheduling of their production. Have they verified the sanitation time is appropriate that they've allotted? Do they have clear written instructions that explain not only chemicals that are being used, but application time, temperatures, and disassembly of equipment? That is something that gets omitted at points too, and that can go for not just allergens, but for any type of sanitation. Do they have dedicated sanitation tools to prevent cross-contact within the sanitation program itself? Verification for dedicated sanitation equipment, have they done that? Have they seen, is it even needed? And when I speak of alternative cleaning measures here, I'm looking at things like product pushes, or using an inert substance to push through the line to clean it. Has that been put in place, and is it being effectively followed? And is there evidence that the facility can demonstrate to you as an auditor that that is present? Now, human errors is more along the lines we can piece into what Laura was talking about when she talks about communication and your return on investment here. But there's a lot here that we can do through the training side and through the communication side to prevent these human errors. How do we communicate our allergen control program? How do we communicate our rework program? Do we have an available allergen control policy for employees to reference? Is there content specifically referring to the allergens that are on site within the training program itself, or is it just generic allergen training? How do they communicate changes in procedures or the procedures themselves to the people that are working on the lines and that are responsible for the actual sanitation, changeovers, and handling of products? And then, is there an auditing program, and I'm speaking more to the internal auditors here, is there a program in place that robustly audits the allergen control program in place? Or is it just a tick off the box saying, yes, we've got a program and we follow it, everything's good? So, as you could see as I went over that list, there's a lot to cover within an allergen program as an auditor. It takes a lot of time. The systems can be extremely complex depending on the products that are produced, depending on the composition of the finished product. So is there an easier way to do this right now? The traditional mindset for some people were to audit each of these items individually. My opinion is there is a much better way, and there's a way that I've been following for several years now. It's using a traceability exercise to audit these programs. And this can be also for other programs within there, but I'm focusing specifically on the allergen control program right now. What this allows you to do is audit multiple areas with one core activity. Now, if you were not present at the SQF conference, Bob Garfield spoke and made some comments regarding traceability within some of his discussions, but this is kind of along the same lines of what he was talking about. What this allows you to do is more efficiently use your time so that you can have a random process in selecting what you need to evaluate, but ensuring that you cover all of your requirements within the SQF code. We know that the time is extremely tight when you're doing these audits. Typically, our audits are between 2 to 3 days, and if we look at how much content is in that SQF code, There's a lot to cover, so we need to be as efficient and as effective as possible, and this will help allow that. What this also does is, because it's a random process, it allows you to determine if the facility is readily knowledgeable of their system and they have ready access to records and programs when requested. It's not all predetermined ahead of time. This also provides you a great snapshot of the maintenance of the allergen program that's in place there. Because it is so random, it allows you to see that. I've found this to be an extremely effective program, and I'm actually going to describe a situation later as to where it came out to be extremely beneficial during an audit. So how can you do this? How do you do this traceability exercise? And where do you start? What do you do? The way that I have instructed my auditors in the past to do this was to go to the retained sample section if they have one and select a product that has multiple ingredients and multiple allergens if possible, that was produced not necessarily a year ago or anything, but was produced not last week. It has a bit more of a time frame on it. You'll use that sample to get your raw material, packaging material specifications, and finished product specifications. There you can verify all of that information. You can verify the registers are accurate. You can verify their program for review of those specifications. Using that sample and the dates in which it was produced on and which those products were received, in which those products were shipped, you can start looking at things like their supplier approval program. Have they been properly verified? Has the allergen controls at the suppliers been effectively reviewed, and have they been checked off on? And if there have been issues, has the facility properly followed up with those issues? You can go directly then to the R&D department for that product if it is one that was developed on site, and interview the personnel at the research and development department to see how the allergen control program was followed within the research and development for that product. You can review the sanitation and changeover procedures and the records associated with the products within there. Now, if this is only one record, you're obviously going to want to have more than just one record for reviewing sanitation. But this allows you at least potentially a time frame, gives you a great starting point to select your records. You can review the production records as well if there was a sequencing requirement within here. If the facility follows a matrix, you can see if the matrix was followed. You can interview your employees how they figured out to schedule this. You can interview them how they would know when to schedule the product or when they could run it. You would review all of your validation records for any type of changeovers that would be followed. Obviously, we talked about this a bit earlier, that this is the most scored item and doesn't seem to typically be an issue, but still it's important that we follow it. It is very, very important that we have validation records to show that our sanitation and allergen control program is effective. And now one of the most important things, and I feel is one of our most overlooked items as auditors, is you review the labeling requirements within there. You see the procedures, and you ensure that the product it confirms to the country of destination. Now, one thing that's important here is you're reviewing the labeling not just for the finished product composition there, but you're looking at how it relates to the raw materials that are being used as well. Now, as I said, where can we improve? We talked about a multitude of items. We talked about some raw material specifications. We talked about sequencing. We talked about looking at rework a lot. But really, where do we want to look at? The most, I feel, as auditors, we really need to start focusing on our label verification process. This is an area where we really need to improve upon because, as we're seeing, allergen recalls are accounting for the majority of our recalls now. We're seeing, if you're looking at those releases, a lot of that is due to poor labeling. A lot of that is due to missing information for potential allergens within those products. Now, to give you an example of this, I had an auditor that worked with me when I was back at SAI Global that was in the process of doing a traceability challenge. Selected a product that had multiple components within it. Asked the facility to furnish all of the required specifications, all of the production records, everything associated with that particular product. As he looked at the specifications and he was looking at dates and he was looking at registers and he looked at the finished product specification and the finished product label, he took a glance at it and saw, oh, I see you have mustard within your raw material here. And they said, yeah, they just changed their formulation of their raw material about 3 months ago. Everything is fine. I went, oh, okay. looked at their finished product label and saw, well, there's no mustard on your label here. Now, as I said, this is in Canada, if you can imagine. So what happened during their audit? They had to issue an actual recall during their actual certification audit. This shows how effective that program is. If we just went, show me your specification, and did not relate that back to the finished product specification and the finished product label, we would not see that gap. It's important that we have something along those lines. So a recap, remember, an allergen control program. This is for everybody that's on this call, not just our auditors and internal auditors. An allergen control program is more than just cleaning. It's more than just segregation. There's much more to it than that. Multiple programs within your system that don't just relate solely to allergen control work with each other to help form and help strengthen the allergen control program that is present and ensure that not only it is effective, but it's easily functional as well. A traceability exercise, as we went over, is a great way to effectively and efficiently use your time during an audit, because we do not have a lot of time to do these audits. We need to make sure we use it as effectively and as efficiently as possible. Remember to avoid soft auditing. This is a difficult trap to get out of as an auditor. It's easy to grab the low-hanging fruit, but remember that these audits are supposed to be deep, thorough, and rigorous. We want to make sure we're focusing on that. Don't go the easy route. Just want to say thank you very much for your time. With that, I'll hand it back to Leanne Shuboff, and I believe we're going to be going to questions and answers in a few seconds. Thank you very much for your time.
Yes, I am. Yes, we are going to go to Q&A. So those were amazing presentations. I appreciate the summary that you guys did. Really, it was really great. We did have a few questions come in, so at this time I'm going to ask that the presenters unmute themselves, and I'll kind of go in somewhat of order. So Kathy Crawford, the first question is for you. I think you did a great explanation of the use of alternate controls. This seems to be a difficult element that our users can't wrap their head around. And we always say good sense and good science with the SQF code. So it's the interpretation and the intent to meet that requirement. So good examples. I guess the question is, so in my opinion, you can use what your idea of a risk assessment was to determine other verification points in the process. So I get a lot of questions such as, not just can I use, air hand dryer instead of paper towels, but really, for example, how can I prevent, a certain risk from occurring? So one question that came in was, so there's about 500 ingredients with multiple mixes of allergens, and they're having a hard time in storage for FIFO and production to be able to separate these ingredients. So, for example, they segregate peanut and also put non-allergen materials separate, but most of the ingredients may have soy, wheat, milk, or other combinations. So due to space, we are unable to segregate by the mini combination in these ingredients. So do you have any suggestions? And so I forward this to you, Kathy, because I think that you can use the risk assessment approach to this particular question. And I know it's a challenge, and I don't know if you want to offset it, because it's a mouthful, and you don't have all the background, but I guess I pose that question to you.
Sure. That is a common question. The code asks for segregation, and it's not unusual for companies to be unable to do so, to have complete, strict segregation because of maybe the structure of their facility and their process. So you have to go back to what is the risk. Don't worry so much about the demand in the control mechanism. Worry about the risk and how you control it. So the risk is cross-contamination. Examine your setup and determine whether or not allergen cross-contamination is likely if you don't have complete segregation. And if through integrity of packaging, through employee training, through some other mechanism that you have in place, you can demonstrate that cross-contact is not likely, then you've done what you need to do in documenting this risk assessment. And this can be really complicated in this area, I know, but as far as brief answers go, I hope that at least sets you off in the right direction.
Yes, that's perfect. So Laura, I have a question for you. I found your topic so interesting, and it really spoke to what Jason Dorsey talked about, the Gen Y guy. And even one little thing that I remembered what he said was to take advantage of those quick feedback moments. So for Generation Y, they don't need a sit-down meeting, but really just quick feedback, whether it's good or bad feedback. You should be doing this differently, or you're doing this great, keep up the good work, whatever it might be. But quick feedback moments, take advantage of those moments, and you really emphasize that in your presentation. And one other thing that as you were talking, I got all excited because I remember about 7 years ago, there was an article by CDC that talked about behaviors and changing the behaviors to influence food safety and identifying those behaviors that make employees do poor practices. So why aren't they washing their hands? Why don't they cool foods quickly, or whatever it might be? So and it talks about the lack of resources, the lack of tools, those kinds of things. So I thought your presentation was great. So quick question regarding the observations. Should those be scheduled? And if so, how many observations do you think should be done in a week? Or is it part of a daily check? Like, what would be your recommendation on that?
Yeah, thanks, Leanne, for the feedback. And that's a great question on observations. So if you look at it, there's a couple different ways. If you're applying this to really reinforce your training and to verify that the training is effective, most people do training in a classroom, instructor-led or otherwise, and then they really, they take a quiz and then they go off and prosper, right? You really don't know if they're taking the information and applying it. So what some very proactive companies are doing is setting up a routine observation on key behaviors, and so that in obviously built around training that you've given them. So what they're doing is they're doing it systematically. So they're identifying those, not all behaviors and not all trainings, but really those that are critical to your organization, and then observing those employees. And you're wanting to get to a critical mass that you're able to really get a good understanding of the compliance, and it's a great way also to measure the effectiveness of your classroom, or instructor-led training. So it's a dual purpose. Ideally, you would want to get those observations for every employee on those key behaviors at least once a year, and ideally twice, because it's a reinforcing opportunity too, which has there's all kinds of data of the power of that to drive a culture. You start getting people communicating and clearly understanding that they're doing the right thing and why they're doing it, then they become your eyes and ears and additional sub-supervisors out there giving that kind of feedback to any new employees that join, et cetera, et cetera. So ideally it would be at least once, preferably a minimum. And that's for compliant behaviors. If you find that you start having non-compliant behaviors, people that are not doing the right thing, then you really should have a follow-up observation, 3 days, 5 days, no more than a couple weeks, to go back and say, okay, are they doing it correctly now? And at some point, you'll get a feeling for maybe they just can't comply. Maybe they need to be moved into a different area because these are critical behaviors, right? And if they can't, after instruction and coaching, if they aren't able to achieve it, then you need to reduce that risk and move them into a different role. But, so non-compliant would take more frequent follow-up observations, and you would just do a deep dive with those folks.
Yeah, and that speaks right into the code in measuring the effectiveness of the training. So The SQF code requires that you have their skills registers and who's been trained, how they were trained, et cetera, and what they were trained on. But it also identifies the effectiveness, how that there is actually a measurement to determine the effectiveness of the behavior. So I think that's perfect. So just as a quick follow-up to that, then how do you identify which behaviors to target? Well, is that based off the skills register or what you were trained on specifically? Is that how?
Well, so I would, some of the things that I've seen folks do is really concentrate on those, again, tying it to business outcomes. So you're wanting, you have a sense in your company of what's being done correctly, consistently, and those troublesome areas, right? Those people that they're just not consistently able to execute. And it might be, for some people, it might be glove use. For other people, it might be hand washing. For other people, it might be, frock use or hat use, hair nets, et cetera. So you're going to focus on those key areas as it's going to have the biggest business outcomes, the most substantial outcomes. And when you focus on those, you could find out, just as a root cause, wow, we don't really have any good training for this particular behaviors that we're having to see. Or, we definitely need to do some reinforcement, some additional training. Or, again, maybe there's some folks that maybe you find that you don't have the management support to consistently make some of these behaviors happen. And so then all of that would be part of your root cause analysis.
Great. Thank you so much. Chris, on to you. Excellent presentation. Allergens, for SQF and for all facilities, top reasons for recall. With, as you said, mislabeling of allergens, the number one reason, but yet, our top nonconformance is really on that validation. So the soft auditing really speaks to what we're trying to promote with SQF, and not just what you're doing for our SQF auditors, but internal auditing. So excellent presentation, and I loved your tip about the traceability exercise. You did make a reference there, what Robert Garfield mentioned regarding traceability. I think you could always do it targeted to allergens, but you can certainly take that traceability exercise and really do an effective review of your SQF system. SQF is a product-based certification, and so if you look at your end product and look at everything associated with that product, whether it's training records, line checks, who made the product, how it was cleaned, how the line was cleaned, and even do a separate one for those allergens, I think that's a great tip and something that we can always implement to truly check the system. So a couple questions came in. The first one is the use of sugar to clear a line or pipe considered an appropriate method of cleaning to remove the presence of an allergen? Swabbing the surface has yielded no presence of the protein.
You would just have to have proper validation to support that. Plus, you'd have to be able to show the amount of time it would take and pressure, et cetera, within that type of product push to ensure that it's being followed each time that it goes through. But using an inert substance like sugar, like salt, things like that, or even a product push is more than acceptable within some industries to do that.
Yep, just need to do the validation method, absolutely. Another question for you is, how effective is ELISA versus ATP when it comes to allergen cleaning effectiveness?
ATP can never really be used for the validation of your allergen control programs, of your sanitation. It sometimes can be used in a way for your verification that cleaning was conducted. That can help out, but it's not the be-all, end-all when it comes to the validation of your allergen control program. That's going to be more based on that ELISA-based method that's going to focus on those items. And one thing that I wish that I could have talked about, but I don't have the knowledge background like Doug did, is he talked about a lot of the testing side of it, seeing that he was with Eurofins, and he was able to describe, even in some cases, doing DNA mapping and things like that at points that could be done with things when you're doing validation studies. So you want a more robust test when it comes to the validation side, and unfortunately ATP doesn't really fall into that area.
Right. I think a good tip, though, is to really look at resources that are available, whether it be through a consultant, or even FARP is a great resource through the University of Nebraska, Steve Taylor, Joe Beaumont. Those guys are great resources to determine some validation techniques and what you can do. So another question for Kathy. You mentioned that you should use a multifaceted team when you're conducting these risk assessments. So what does that mean? Like, who should be on the risk assessment team?
Well, it's similar to your HACCP team or your food safety team, that those programs shouldn't be just developed by your QA personnel. You have to include others involved in the process, whether that's a maintenance person, a sanitation person, or even a salesperson who understands your customers and their concerns. Those would be the kind of people that you might want to include.
Okay, perfect. And then I have one last question that came in, and this is for Chris. Can you define segregation in allergen storage? Is there a certain distance, such as 6 inches or a foot, or do you need separate rooms? Can you help provide some guidance to that?
There's nothing within the code that specifically states you have to have it 6 feet apart, you have to have it this many feet apart. It just has to be an effective way to show that you're not going to have cross contact between your allergens in there. Typically speaking, I guess an industry best practice, if you want to say, is like 4 feet or so, like a pallet space. But there's nothing that states you have to have it to a certain amount. What you need to look at is the volatility of the packaging in that product, how likelihood is cross-contact going to occur, and as was brought up before, doing your risk assessments to show why you are storing it that way. There's not really a be-all, end-all for the proper storage. It's really has to take into account what is going on in your facility and tailor-make that allergen control program and that segregation program to meet your needs and what you have in place there. Sorry, it's not being kind of ambiguous, but it's not. There's not a black or white answer within this situation.
Exactly. I mean, I think it goes back to what Kathy is talking about and doing the risk assessment, because it's going to vary depending on the nature of the allergen, right?
Yeah.
If it's liquid, if it's powder, if it's whatever it might be. So I think you got to look at doing that risk assessment to identify what is the potential risk if I'm storing my ingredients this way. So one other question just came in, actually 2 questions. So the allergens is a big topic for these folks. Next one is about the ELISA method. There are some auditors that insist that it's the only way of the ELISA method for validation. Is that the only acceptable method by SQF, and auditors insist that it's the only way? So you want to tackle it, Chris, or?
Well, I know that you have your guidance paper online that talks about the type of allergen validation that you can do, and that sort of speaks to your question that you have there when it comes to what is required and what is not required. The only thing that I'll point out is the code doesn't clearly state thou shalt only use ELISA-based methods. So
right.
that's the best answer I guess I can give you. Is an auditor that comes in and interprets the code that way isn't necessarily interpreting it correctly, and not saying they're necessarily wrong either. It depends on how you're validating your systems. So as long as you can produce appropriate records to support that your program is effective, the auditor should be able to accept that.
Correct.
If you want to if you want to expand on that at all, Leanne, go ahead. But there's
Nope, you're right. You're right. So auditors need to audit against the SQF code, and the SQF code requires that you have a validation method in place that verifies the effectiveness of your cleaning to reduce the chance of cross contact between changeovers. So in our allergen guidance, and I emphasize guidance for a reason because that's what it is. What we wanted to do is provide some guidance to the suppliers in order to determine what type of validation methods do they need to have in place. And we worked with some experts out there to go over the guidance. And we're continuing to work with experts, like I said, with Steve Taylor and Joe Beaumont with FARP. They are working with us to identify other validation methods because it really does depend. There might be visual observation, depends on the allergen, sesame seeds, for example, or it has to be ELISA method simply because that is a method that's controlled and an appropriate method that really identifies if the protein is there. But it truly has to look at the validation methods for the allergen and the protein and allergen that you're trying to eliminate. So there are different tests for different proteins. It has to sync up that way. That's why I think the ATP method is not an approved method, only because you're not really targeting a specific protein that you're trying to eliminate. So really look at the validation methods, seek industry experts that are out there, and use what's available to ensure that you're doing the right thing, not just to meet the code requirements, but to reduce any type of cross-contact between allergens, okay? So that's the intent behind it. Use the right resources. Oh, gosh. So a couple other questions came in for you, Chris, and I'll ask them quickly, and then I'll just email them to you, and perhaps you can send them out. But one person said they have 6 allergens in house, and all 6 are declared in the product labels. They have an allergen control policy. Do they still have to do production sequencing?
If all of the same allergens are in the same products?
Yeah.
I wouldn't. It'd be like going from one type of bread to another type of bread that has same wheat in it. I wouldn't be terribly concerned about it. If you're looking on a quality front, however, then you might want to look at something along those lines. But when it comes to the safety front, and it's specifically to allergens, I wouldn't be as concerned about it.
Right, yeah. Then the other question is, do we have to have a list of all the allergens that may be contained or have trace of for all the ingredients that are used for our final product label? So it's about the finished product label. If there's allergens in when do they use the term may contain or have a trace of on the label?
Oh boy, that's another long discussion to have. When may contain, and that's an hour-long webinar in itself.
Okay. We'll have
there's a lot of challenges and a lot of misconceptions with that one, with the use of may contain and could contain and produced in a facility that handles and all that kind of stuff. If the safest way to go is if the threat of the product could be if the threat of an allergen could be present within a product, it's safe for you to confirm that that is present. Now, Doug touched on this a little bit in his presentation when he was talking about it, when he was going through doing product testing on your raw materials to confirm the presence of potential allergens in that as well. So that's one way that you could determine that sort of situation. There's a multitude of items, but to really tell you that you have to list every single one. If it's a threat to your product, you have to kind of take that into consideration when you're looking at building your allergen control program. And one key thing to remember is there's no real true at least within the U.S. right now, there's no real thresholds established other than not being present for allergens. They don't say that it's okay. It's not like a gluten-free claim in some cases where you could sort of say that. There's nothing that clearly states, okay, you can have 5 ppm of peanut in here and then it's fine. Nothing that says that. So you have to kind of look at it at that side of things as well. So it's, again, not an easy answer to say when you can use the may contain side, but if you do have the threat of that allergen being present in your raw material or your packaging material, then it should be included within the allergen control program.
Exactly. And just yep, and just to add on to that, don't use it as a control, though. I mean, as a fallback. I think what we're finding that over-labeling so consumers are getting kind of numb to the labeling. So there was a study that was conducted, and they said, about 10 years ago, 85% of the consumers were following those may contain statements and not buying products that may contain these ingredients if they have allergens, a food allergy. Then they did the study 5 years later, and only 75% of the consumers are paying attention to those may contain statements. So we got to be careful of the overuse of labeling, but Chris is right. If there's a threat that is going to be in that product, then you definitely need to include that in there. So great
The
question.
use of a may contain statement can't be used to negate the requirement for proper sequencing, proper annotation, proper validation, et cetera.
Exactly. So perfect. All righty. So that sums up our questions. Thank you very much to our presenters. I really appreciate the information that you shared. I missed all of 3 of your sessions, so maybe I picked your sessions on purpose simply because I wanted to hear about them, and I didn't have an opportunity to attend. So great sessions. Thank you very much. So just to kind of wrap things up, I want to give you a little bit about what our upcoming events are. We had our webinar today, and I appreciate everybody joining in on the call. We will be sending out these presentations. So the presentations are on the conference app. If you download the app, the full presentations are. We'll be sending out this the link to the webinar it will be found on our website. In the presentation, we can PDF the presentation and send it out to the participants, so everybody can get a copy of this. We also have lead auditor training next week in Oak Brook for our 5-day lead auditor and our 3-day. Our next year lead auditor trainings are all up on our website. If you go to sqfi.com/events, all of our events are posted on the website. Here are our learning lunches that we have already posted on the website that we had this year. We had 7 learning lunches. We had one in Spanish and English, the sanitation one by Tatiana Lorca. And then we had one just recently on moving from level 2 to level 3. So all of our webinars are on the SQF website under events. So if you go sqfi.com and you click on events, then you'll see all of our learning lunch, and you can simply review the webinar at your leisure. This webinar will be up there as well. Next year, we have our learning lunch topics identified all the way through September. So what we did is kind of looked at identifying, starting off the new year with establishing those food safety and food quality objectives, and really targeting as to where you want to go in the following year when it comes to your facility, and identifying what are those smart food safety and food quality objectives, and then we'll talk about those nonconformances that we see within SQF. And then we have a bunch of different programs. One of the things that we don't have, and I know that we're going to add, is one on allergens, because apparently there's a lot of questions out there. So we are going to work with our experts, and maybe Chris can join us and the other technical experts that were on that allergen panel to have a learning lunch specifically on allergens and labeling of allergens. I think that would be a great topic as well. Our professional updates for next year have been set, and those are also on our website. So if you're an SQF professional, meaning an auditor, a trainer, or a consultant, this is part of your registration criteria and something that you need to attend. So take a look at these dates. They're in Eastern Standard Time as well as Australian Eastern Standard Time, Daylight Time. So make sure you check it out wherever you are and register for one of the professional updates. We lead auditor courses will be, like I said, have been scheduled for next year as well. So again, check out our website. We have courses outside of North America in Sydney, Australia, and one in Tokyo, Japan. So be sure to check out our website for all the latest training courses. Currently, what we have available is our SQF systems course. So we have, I know Kathy Crawford is one of our registered trainers and is able to do these instructor-led courses. It's in English and Spanish. So we have everything available, and it's up to date to the latest edition of 7.2. There's new activity workbooks, a new examinee guide. There's a practice exam. So Christy Grzywinski, our senior training manager, she has updated all the information. We also have updated our online course, so that is also available, and that's in 7.2 in English and Spanish. And it has a neat little workbook that you can download and use. So it's a great online program. And online is something that if you don't have access to a trainer or don't have the time to go to the class, it's a great way to get that information for 7.2. And we also updated our examination, so everything's going to 7.2, and it's all readily available. And you can go on our SQF website under the training tab to look at our training centers, those that are approved as trainers, and find the online training course as well. Soon we will have our packaging auditor training course. We did a pilot course conducted in October, and we're going to have our next course scheduled for March. It's a 3-day course. The packaging auditor training course are for those auditors that want to audit in the packaging food sector category, so food sector category 27. It's also great for suppliers in the packaging industry. It talks not just about packaging material, but what are those risks and threats when auditing against or auditing in a food packaging facility. So it's a great 3-day course. It has a lot of good, useful information. We've partnered with Kessler Management Group and have some really great instructors for that course. And we also have the Advanced SQF Practitioner course. We have improved instructors that are listed on our website. Kathy Crawford is one of those approved instructors. So the Advanced Practitioner course is a great course. There's also an online exam available. The Practitioner course, it takes those internal audit results that the supplier gets and helps them create ways to identify those food safety and food quality objectives and those key performance indicators to target areas that you want to continuously improve. So it looks at, in the internal audit program, it looks at developing corrective action and preventative actions for long-term control, and then again creating those KPIs for operational efficiency. So it's a great course. We call it Advanced Practitioner because it's taking the information that you get, the data that you collect, all the trends that you analyze, and what do you do with that information. So this is a great course that kind of gives you some ideas as to what you can do and how you can take that information. So check out our website, sqfi.com, under the training tab to see who can teach that Advanced Practitioner course. Coming in 2015, we'll have a new exam for that and some updated materials for the Advanced Practitioner. And we're also going to create an online course for quality. So our online training provider is Alchemy, and they are helping us create this online quality program. And what we want to do is create an online training to help the supplier look at developing their quality program in their facility. So kind of going from level 2 to level 3. Look at what those quality parameters are, how to apply that HACCP method to quality and identify those critical quality points, and then looking at the the PDCA cycle to improve those quality outcomes, and those quality management principles to improve productivity. So we really are shaping the quality shaping and creating this online program. It will be ready by mid-next year, and it's an online program that anybody can use, and we'll make sure that we have an announcement sent out to everybody once that's available. So for next year, save the date, 2015, for our international conference. It's November 3rd through the 5th. It's at a JW Marriott in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I know you think, oh, no, Indiana. Indiana is actually a very lovely state, and Indianapolis is a super great town. It's right in the heartland. It's right near a lot of manufacturers. Indianapolis is easy to get to. It's drivable. You can fly into it. It's going to be beautiful at the end of November. The color is changing. The temperature is going to be perfect. But really, what we've given you here today is just some tidbits as to what you could have experienced at the SQF conference. It's a great, fantastic show. You can network with your peers, update on the latest SQF program, on the updates to the program. You meet new friends and contacts, and it's always great to network with some of the experts that are out there. So save the date for next year, November 3rd through the 5th at the JW Marriott. It's a pretty new hotel, and we got some great hotel rates. So this will be another fantastic conference. And with that, I want to say thank you to everyone who participated today. The link will be available within the next week. We hope we see you in Indiana in 2015. And with that, I'll sign off. And a great thank you to our speakers, Kathy Crawford, Laura Nelson, and Chris Middleton. And a bigger thank you to Alkami for sponsoring this learning lunch. We really appreciate your support for the SQF program and for really, helping us with the conference as well as this learning lunch. And thank you again to all of our speakers and to you that participated on this webinar. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Thanks.